Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Our discussant today is Amy Wax, Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania and an authority on social welfare policy and law.
I'm Larry Mead. Welcome to our audience. Really appreciate your interest in this subject of poverty and culture. We're going to be talking about an idea called cultural difference, which is derived initially from my book called Burdens of Freedom, but we may be going somewhere else depending on how the discussion goes. Great fact about culture in America is that we're divided. We have a dominant culture, which is individualist, which came initially from Europe with immigrants, and which is the principal reason, according to historians, why America became a very rich, very powerful country. At the same time, however, culture poses a problem for us because we also have minorities in the country who came from outside Europe, didn't come from the Western world, and they have a different way of life. And so our struggle is to unify the country to bring us together. I just want to summarize briefly what the chief differences are between the individualist culture of the dominant culture in the country and minority culture. First of all, individualists are people who are pursuing goals that they have set. They've decided what they want out of life, and they're going after it. And so they're inner driven. They have a purpose in life, and they're organized towards achieving it. And that's distinct from the non-Western world, where typically attitudes are more cautious. People don't aspire so much to change things as simply to adjust to the pressures that they face from the outside world. So it's a more cautious culture. It's also more collective in the sense that people think of themselves more as members of groups and not as individuals. And the second big difference is about how people think in terms about right and wrong. Western culture, the individualist culture, is moralistic. By that I mean it tends to judge right and wrong according to general principles, which people typically learn in childhood. In contrast to that, the non-West has a more conformist ethos where people do what is expected of them by the people around them. It's not based on generalized principles, but rather on adjustment to a social context. Now, two great facts we want to emphasize going in, and that is that no culture is superior to the other. Western culture is good at some things, not good at some other things. And the same is true for the non-West. So we're not talking about superior and inferior at all. And the second big difference is that these cultures have no necessary connection to race. Although it's true right now that most individualists in America are white people who came from Europe, and most non-Westerners are non-whites who came from somewhere else. Although that's true, it's not necessary at all. My sources say very clearly that culture is unrelated to race. Culture depends really on how you're socialized. And so the situation in America is complicated in that some members of all groups are individualists and some other members of all groups are non-individualists. We can speak of a general division between an individualist and non-individualist culture, but there's a lot of complexity to it. Okay, now let me ask Amy to react to all this.
Well, good morning. Let me say that I'm very familiar with your work and your wonderful book, The Burdens of Freedom, and I have looked again at your introduction, and I am pretty much in agreement with your observations, with maybe just a few tweaks and observations of my own. First of all, I am not sure that pure culturism is an accurate way of looking at the obvious behavioral differences that you confront and that you acknowledge, and I confront them and acknowledge them too. between people who come from non-Western, or maybe we could call them pre-Enlightenment cultures, and people who come from Western post-Enlightenment cultures. That's a rough way of dividing it. John Darbyshire, in a recent piece in Chronicles, I thought set forth a very clear tripartite paradigm for possible explanations for the disparities that we observe in achievement, in family structure, in criminality, in all of the indicia of behavior that you're concerned with. He says we can either ascribe it to pervasive racism, structural racism, and of course that's the fashion of the day, ever more aggressively asserted, to differences in culture, that he calls that culturism, and I locate your book and your insights squarely in that camp. Or third, to what he perhaps euphemistically calls biological diversity, that is that there are some innate or genetic differences between groups that might bear on behavior, on temperament, and that sort of thing that could contribute to this. Now, I understand you to pretty squarely reject the third as any kind of viable explanation. Yeah. I would take issue with that, not because I think I have the answer on that question, but just because I think that more and more evidence is accumulating that it plays a part, or possibly plays a part. And as I said to Glenn Lowry not long ago, if I had to place a high stakes bet on whether genetic variance makes some difference, I would probably bet in favor of it, acknowledging that the database, although fairly substantial on this and very suggestive, is very far from persuasive and is really just nascent at this point. Whether it will ever develop further, given the opposition of very important people in our culture to such ideas, and research remains to be seen. So that would be number one. Now, what we want to do with that kind of a suggestion is really, I think, a very vexed question. The second insight that I would bring is that I am a little bit uneasy with your use of the term or concept of individualism, because it seems to imply a bunch of very atomized renegades kind of running around the society, going their own way, opposing any imposition of authority or any kind of canonical code for how they ought to think and behave. And I'm not sure that that ever was really an accurate picture, and I'm not sure it's an accurate picture today. I think what is really going on is something more along the lines of what Tocqueville said quite a long time ago, because although much has changed, much has not, which is that there is a very strong conformist streak in Western society and in American society in fealty to established, tried and true and tested norms. Now, those are very much Western norms, okay? But one of those norms that I think is brought to its highest instantiation in the United States is what I will call, for lack of a better term, neophilia, the love of, the interest in the new, in progress, in improvement, in self-improvement. These are all trends that you have identified, but I think that they're held on a collective level as sort of our agreed upon ethos that is imbued in our personality, that is very much something we pay common fealty to. It's one of the reasons why conservatism has never really gotten a strong foothold and is more and more tenuous in our society, is this desire for self-criticism, for moralizing public life, and all of the trends that go with that. But I think it's important to see that this is not just something that's manifested in particular people, but also collectively. It's kind of a collective ethos. Now, I'm not sure whether, how much difference that makes, but I think it does make a difference, because you have to cope with the fact that on some important level, we are a conformist society where pressure from other people really makes a big difference and counts. And also that, at least in the past, a lot of our individualism was incorporated into institutions and institutional understandings. Now, you kind of acknowledge that, and that you say it manifests itself in good government, in honest and transparent and stable government, honest dealing, which the West sort of has the market cornered on, I think, is fair to say. Okay, so that, I don't know what to do with that. Maybe we can explore it. The final very short insight that I would bring here is you talk about the penchant for self-criticism, which is very much part and parcel of improvement, of progressivism, of getting better, making our country better, making the world better as a general matter. But I think what's going on today is that our self-improvement impulse has become pathological. We are engaging in excessive self-criticism to the point of self-hatred and self-loathing, and this manifests itself as this whole kind of white supremacy obsession, this anti-Western movement. It's kind of gone off the rails. So what I guess I would emphasize is that a lot of these characteristics that are our strength, the strength of Western individualism, it's very important to hold them in balance. And what I see is that they have gotten out of balance, that they have been driven to extremes. And it's interesting to explore why we have reached this point of self-destructive, almost suicidal extremity in some of these positive trends.
Amy, let me just make a few quick reactions to what you say. I'm largely in support of what you said. Just a couple of points. You described non-Western culture as pre-Enlightenment. I'd say rather that even pre-Enlightenment, and indeed way back to the foundations of Europe, the psychology of the West is different from the non-West. It already shows
That's fair.
Central features of individualism, moralism, and so on. As to physical differences, I'm just now reading a couple of books by Charles Murray that I'm about to be reviewing, his recent books about human diversity and also facing reality. And in these books, he very much supports your view that there are physical differences between the races and that they need not be denied. But at the same time, he's very cautious in attributing to those the characteristic behavioral problems that you mentioned. And in fact, he doesn't give a good explanation for those patterns. And this is where I think culture is, in fact, much more important than physical differences.
Can I just comment on that? Say something about that? I think physical is a little misleading because, it's this trope that evolution and the importance of genetic program stops at the neck. Well, it obviously doesn't, because it manifests itself. I think there's good evidence in our psychology and our behavior. Now, I agree with Charles Murray that, there's very poor exposition or understanding of how these differences might manifest itself in family breakdown, in crime, even the big problems that we're seeing with poor people in our country. But cognitive differences, I think, is where he's on one is on the strongest ground.
But the surprising thing is that the behavioral problems you mentioned, which are undoubted, are actually quite recent. That is, until the 60s, we didn't really have a generalized breakdown among non-Western groups. It was what we see today. That didn't happen because IQ and other physical features change only slowly. You really can't attribute the breakdown of lower income society on that. We have to look at a change in the culture, and I think the change is, as you also had mentioned, that the society stopped really to insist upon good behavior. Now, is that conformity? You say individualism, to speak of that is to neglect the elements of conformity. I think it isn't really conformity, it's rather moralism. That is, people may be told by other people that they need to behave better, but that then cues an attitude that they've learned, usually in early childhood, about good behavior. And it's this that keeps the individualist on the rails.
Norms, perhaps, yes.
And in fact, The surprising thing about individualism is its capacity not only to pursue individual directions, which is really important for dynamism and economic growth and change, but also capacity to build the strongest public institutions the world has ever seen. I mean, it's amazing to me that a society that is so critical of government is also so well governed. There really is only one other country in the world which has generated this level of good government without having an individualist culture. You can probably guess what that is.
Japan.
Yes, Japan. Japan has unusual features.
Which is a wonder. Japan deserves further study. It's quite remarkable.
That's correct. Japan is not an individualist country. To the contrary, it's very collective-minded. Don't think of themselves apart from the group. They have all the features that I'm calling non-Western, but at the same time, they have strong government. And to me, that is a miracle. And it shows that this is all about culture, really not about anything that's dictated by race. It really isn't. So anyway, and I also—
Can I just say one thing about conformity and moralism? I think you're right that it's better labeled as a kind of convergence of moralism. It looks like, I mean, everybody's sort of on the same page, so there are different ways you can label that. But going to my pathological extremism point, our moralism has now veered off into this kind of secular wokeness.
Yes.
I mean, you know, John McWhorter talks about the elect and about how this is really a religion. And yes, that is so much the manifestation of this fervent moralism. That is what progressivism and wokeness is, extreme progressivism and wokeness.
Jason, did you have a comment?
Yes, my comment was the question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My comment is a question. To what degree do you two think that the change in culture among minorities is merely an artifact of the fact of free income over time, making it less important that families stay together to support each other, and allowing the disintegration, because you didn't see that among minorities before the 1960s.
That's true, and I have to say there's something to what you're saying. Of course, this is an argument Charles Murray made in Losing Ground back in the 60s, no, in the 80s rather, and which other conservatives have made. The reason I'm skeptical is that research about how welfare benefits and other income affects family stability is not generally supportive of that idea. We don't generally find evidence that people make, shall we say, rational decisions to have an irregular family because they can get income anyway from government. It's not a rational decision to have a single parent family. That is no way to characterize that as rational, even when there is welfare. It, in fact, represents a breakdown of what low-income people themselves wish. They also affirm. See, the crazy thing about low-income behavior, although it obviously is destructive, isn't something that people directly will. On the contrary, they affirm traditional values. The poor population is conservative and conventional about its values. What isn't conventional is the actual lifestyle. So the striking difference is the incapacity to actually live according to one's own values. It's the lack of self-command. That's and conversely, among individualists, what stands out about the culture is that people do have self-command. And you have to ask why it is most of us feel at ease talking to other individuals, even though they may be assertive and argumentative and we disagree with them, but we're not afraid of them. We believe they have self-command. But in low-income areas, we often are afraid of people, even though they're not asserting themselves. In fact, it's precisely because they're not asserting themselves that we fear them, because they don't have self-command. It's not predictable what they're going to do. But for individuals, it is predictable. They have set a goal and they're aiming towards it. It's this that gives their life direction. And other people see that and they know where they're coming from. We use that phrase, you know where you're coming from. Okay? That is what makes America draw. That's what generates American dynamism, is the fact that most people are in fact pursuing their own goals. And it's precisely this which you don't see among the low population. They're not pursuing their own goals. They're engaging in confusion. They're engaging in what I call survival. They're getting by day by day by day and not actually pursuing a long-term goal.
Can I just comment on this?
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
a very complex subject. The whole idea does welfare cause poverty is, a longstanding debate, and
yeah,
Charles Murray has shifted his position several times. And I think the position he ended up with is that welfare was a kind of enabling fuel that allowed people
yeah,
to subsist, and really go with the loosening mores of the 60s. I think they're really two parallel developments. There's welfare, which has been tightened up, which did have this enabling function, but also there was a massive sea change in the culture where norms were pretty much abandoned
yeah,
or no longer prescribed across the board. The decline in
yeah,
respectability
yeah,
norms was, I think, absolutely critical. In terms of rationality, it's not really rational to be a single mom. I mean, the poorer
that's what
you
I'm saying.
are, from a microeconomic point of view, the more valuable it is to team up with someone else and sort of double your
Yeah,
income. So, the notion that this is economic man acting in their own interest or woman really doesn't withstand scrutiny. That leads to the whole debate of, you know, what is the value of these strongly prescribed norms and stigma? I have written about this. My theory is that the less sort of inner directed and the less agentic people are, and you yourself have said that those traits tend to be concentrated in people from non-Western societies, and I agree with that. The more these norms are necessary, these simple rules for simple people, to keep these very short-term
yeah,
thinking behaviors in check. So one of the things I've argued is that the decline in these bright line rules for conduct and roles that
yeah,
individuals are urged to play has hurt the least capable people in
yes,
society the
yes,
most, right?
yeah,
The most vulnerable. And we see that in the numbers. And
yeah,
they're the ones that most need to maintain good marriages, stable lives,
yeah,
intact families, and the like. And we've seen the paradox that the most capable and educated people are the ones who are most likely
yeah,
to live the 50s, even while they're talking the 60s. And that is a fascinating
yeah,
phenomenon that I don't think any demographer has really adequately explained.
yeah.
The
See,
demographers that are the most honest, like Bob Pollock at Washington University, they've said, hey, this is a puzzle that needs explaining, because the women who are the least needful of husbands are the ones who are most likely to have them. And he attributes it to the realization that an intact two-parent family is necessary for these upper middle class elites to maintain their status and transmit
yeah,
it to their children. Now, the problem with that thesis is that it doesn't explain why people lower down don't see that it's necessary for upward mobility for their children.
yeah.
Like, why would they
Well,
not realize that? So
but
there are a lot of puzzles here, and I think, just to give the conclusion, the punchline, welfare and income supports are, I think, at this point, only a small part of it.
yeah,
It is really a cultural phenomenon first and
yeah.
foremost.
So you have to explain why in the non-Western countries in which these groups all descend, including today's immigrants in most cases, show the same level of social disorder we find here. And the reason is, in those countries, and this is according to what the research says about non-Western culture, what if the moral structure is based on external authority, mostly on convention, on traditions, as well as on government. And people do what they know to be right because they're told that all the time by these outside forces. But that's not the same as internalizing the norms in the way that the West
Right.
does. So,
It's a
so
combination, though, yeah. And I think people who are less likely to internalize the norms or less capable of internalizing the norms. And here I would bring up IQ, and just, intelligence is part of it. It's harder to self-regulate.
yeah,
So
that's
it's a
true.
combination
Yeah,
of the tradition of the sort of lack of tradition of self-regulation
yeah, I
and
think that's
difficulty of self-regulation.
yeah. But you have to, but at the same time, and the most successful charter schools are a good example, they do manage to instill in very young children a set of proprieties about getting through school. Those students then are able to carry forward when they leave school. So there's some evidence that you can, in fact, promote the early socialization and good behavior, which the upper class and the middle class takes for granted. I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do in Burdens of Freedom is to overthrow
Can you just
the
move
notion.
closer to your microphone here, Steve?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're talking about like charter schools and intense socialization schools. It's not clear how successful they are in the long term. There are marginal effects in socialization.
It's more than marginal. Now, how long it lasts, that isn't entirely clear yet. I'm not sure it's quite as effective as you see amongst a really individualist culture. That's probably true. But nonetheless, it shows that people who don't measure high in IQ are nonetheless able to internalize the norms that allow them to function in a free society. I mean, the irony here is that those who function well in a free society are, in an important sense, unfree. They have internalized norms of good behavior that do not leave them free to do anything they want. On the contrary, the phrase I used a long time ago, those who will be free must first be bound. And the child is bound in the cradle, hopefully, with a set of norms about good behavior. And then they venture forth into the world. And those norms keep them on the rails, and they resist temptation because they know what's right. It's quite different from conformity, where you react to the current pressure of people to do a certain thing. That's what you find in the non-West. So there is a moral structure in the non-West. It depends upon that external authority. And that's what people lose in America. When they come here, we assume an individualist culture. We don't have that external pressure in the systematic way that you find in the non-West. And then people can fall apart. So for these groups, freedom is a threat. It is not good news. And they have to learn how to be free. And that means how to be show the self-command that freedom assumes.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you, but I would make the following point. If you go back 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, and you actually watch a program about what happened at the turn of the century or whatever, you realize it's quite striking that the culture really gave a much more uniform and self-confident message about how people were supposed to behave. I think one of the things that's happened is that we have lost our confidence, our sense of authority, our self-regard. I think that's been catastrophic, frankly. But there was a much more uniform message. Now, this competed with, this kind of innovative individualism, this neophilia that produced a very significant bohemian class, which was also funded by and enabled by our growing affluence. For example, if you see the three-part Hemingway biography, you see this just in spades. I mean, this tug of war between his conventional upbringing, his parents' religiosity and moralism, and his, bohemianism, his artistic inclinations, was constantly at war. But here's the thing, and I've kind of made this insight in other contexts. The Bohemians knew that they were marginal and that they had to stay that way. They wanted the freedom to do what they would, but they never claimed pride of place and said we should go from the periphery, from the edge to the center. We are the main event. We should dictate and establish the ethos of the whole society. They knew their place. And I think that is really what's different. And what I'm saying is I don't disagree with you that a lot of these mores and norms were internalized and that Western people are particularly attuned or enabled to internalize through whatever the cultural development of the culturally conditioned development of their personality is. I agree with you about that, absolutely. But eventually, even that internalization is going to erode if it's not backed up by the general culture. And I think we're seeing that.
See, in certain respects, the liberations of the 60s and early 70s were overtaken by a more conservative public opinion, which insisted upon enforcing the criminal law, was tougher on welfare, tougher on the schools. And in fact, we are much more orderly today than we were 30 years ago.
So stigma against out of wedlock births has not
no, that's true.
succeeded.
That one, see, I think much of what drives the permissiveness that you mentioned, and I agree that it's still there, much of what drives it is a desire to be inclusive towards minorities that in fact do not fulfill the proprieties that the individualist culture takes for granted, especially about marriage. It isn't just blacks, Hispanics as well have an unmarried pregnancy rate of over half. And in some groups,
that data is hidden from us, of course, by the propaganda, engines and the media. The media is cynically hiding any of the data, like the out of wedlock births among Hispanics that doesn't fit with their narrative. Yes.
See, what the press reflects is what I call the ideology of sameness, that everyone's the same.
Right.
And therefore we don't need to worry about any of these issues we're talking about. And it's interesting that Charles Murray uses the very same term, sameness, in his books. So the idea that everyone's the same has to be rejected. Now, it isn't racial difference that counts. When you question sameness, you're not saying that a black person is different from a white person. What you're saying, rather, is an individual is different from somebody who is living in terms of conformity with outside pressure. And that is, see, the thing, I've always been amazed that no commentary about poverty that I know, not a single author, has ever focused on, to me, the really radical and obvious difference between let's call them the individualists, and the poor. And that is the individuals are simply more assertive. They're not passive. They're going somewhere. And that's why they're formidable. And that makes life difficult for people who come from other cultures, which are not assertive, which are all about conformity. Why isn't this obvious? Just walking down the street, you can see it. Individualists are moving faster. They're going somewhere. They have a goal. Whereas people from the non-Western groups are much more cautious. They're tentative in their movements. What they don't do, and this is what the individuals do, they don't have the same capacity to mobilize, to commit their energy to a distant goal, and then to do what it takes to achieve that. The capacity to mobilize. I think you can even say sublimation is a unique psychology of the individualist culture that allows people to take on board the responsibilities that go with their goals, the things that they have to do. I mean, this is why in Burdens of Freedom, I twice actually cite Hegel's philosophy about these matters. Basically, Hegel says that freedom is obligation. And that is what individuals, that's how they actually live. In pursuing their goals, they accept the obligations that go with those goals. They are unfree, and therefore they are free. They're inwardly unfree to be outwardly free. And it's that generates the enormous energy that drives the West towards wealth and power.
Well, I think
other people. It's quite difficult for other people because they find themselves surrounded by these dynamos who are impatient and competitive, who demand that they get on board, and the pressure to perform is relentless. I mean, just getting this podcast underway this morning, we had trouble getting the podcast prompt to go out to you. That put the heat on me, and I put heat on Michelle, and we got it together. Well, that happens all the time in individualist culture. People put pressure on themselves and pressure on other people.
But Larry, I don't see pressure coming into the underclass. When I worked in a low-income neighborhood on the properties to try and get them online and back in order, what I saw was that the men who were supported by the women's lease on welfare, the underclass men do not transition from high school, where there is order externally imposed, to self-imposed order, because they don't believe, unlike the middle class, that there's a psychological pressure to take a job, which is entry-level jobs are tedious, and go to work every day. If you are free enough mentally to be able to survive without having to go to work. You're going to accept that. Only the culture will impose its values on you and get you to go to work. That's not happening now. I think it's
No, I
because of
agree.
welfare.
No,
Well,
it
I
isn't
think
happening.
I think you have to be careful here because there are differences among even individuals from non-Western backgrounds
Yeah,
in terms of how their passivity and resignation manifests itself. So notoriously, Hispanics, certainly first generation, it remains to be seen what happens in subsequent generations, are very sedulous and hardworking, if not, not necessarily aggressive about quote unquote getting ahead. Whereas
yeah,
native born blacks are not as hardworking. I think that is manifested just
yeah,
in the data. And of course, it's papered over with this sort of macho aggressiveness, which is not the same as
yeah.
self-efficacy,
But
quite
the puzzle,
unlike it. But I would also say that there are other manifestations of this passivity that are very important, that are just systematically ignored by pundits and the media and the powers that be. So let me just take the physical environment, because this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, which is just litter and decrepitude of one's physical surroundings. I got my vaccine through a website called Find a Shot. It became a game on the part of my husband to find me a shot, and he found one in one of the worst, most godforsaken areas of Philadelphia,
yeah,
Kensington, where I had never stepped foot, and drove there to a drugstore, and I was struck, I was just gobsmacked by the amount of trash on the street. I mean,
yeah,
not a little bit. We're talking about ankle deep. Every curb, every street, every park, every lawn,
yeah.
every inch. Okay. I mean, I will just say it was disgusting, just
Well,
revolting.
okay,
And
I
these
want
were
to,
neighborhoods that had a stock of kind of working class housing. I mean, they could have been really nice. And when I went into this neighborhood, I thought, this is why we can't have nice things. I mean, can you imagine living with this? And yet people would sit around pretending not even to notice it, or maybe not noticing it. And of course, the official account is, well, my neighborhood, which is an upper middle class white neighborhood, isn't like that because of government services, which is an
yeah,
out and out lie.
yeah,
I mean, we've never had any trash picked up in our street by the government. We don't put it there in the first place, or people
yeah.
go out with trash bags and pick up the little bit there is. Okay. Whereas in this neighborhood, it is everywhere.
Well,
Now, why isn't that talked about? These
all
are
right.
pronounced
The reason it's not
behavioral
talked about,
differences. If I could
the,
just finish, these are
yeah,
pronounced behavioral differences, deep attitudinal differences about one's physical environment that relate to civic mindedness, that relate to a penchant
yeah,
for order, that relate to, sort of bourgeois, the puritanical values about cleanliness being next to
yeah.
godliness. I mean, it really goes on and on. It's
Well,
quite profound,
I
I
want
think.
to come back to what Jason said a moment ago about what you described, who didn't really have a sense of of structural life after they left school. This is, I think, the same phenomena you're talking about, Amy. You see, in the non-Western culture, people are free of the inhibitions that structure middle-class life, but but then they have to deal with outward pressures. They're outwardly unfree precisely because they're inwardly too free. See, it's the opposite of the individualist culture, where people accept inner obligations in order to become outwardly free. What the non-West does, and you see this in the low-income areas, and you see it amongst non-working men and so on. What you see is people who don't see a necessity to act until there's pressure put on them from the outside world. The pressure isn't coming from inside them, from the goals that they have, and it's the willingness to tolerate the inner goals and the structure that they impose on your life. That is what the middle class has and what the individualist culture has. And it's strange. There's no other culture in the world that shows this proclivity to burden oneself. In the non-West, all the structure of order is external. And whereas for the West, it's mostly internal. And we do have external enforcement, but it's concentrated on the low-income groups that come from the non-Western world, but they don't have the inner commandedness that allows one to be orderly without it. So, but this is why the West is able to combine freedom with order.
Yeah, can I just say something though? I think we're at the point now in our culture where we have affirmatively and aggressively taken our foot off the gas pedal on, outward manifestations of those inward imperatives. I once again return to the concept that the inward and the outward work together in consonance, and that the sort of middle class bourgeois imperatives, which were internalized for people from Western origins, were imposed under an assimilationist ethos not long ago on people who came of somewhat different backgrounds. Now, how well that took, it didn't take very well for Black Americans, I can tell you that. How well it would take for indigenous Hispanics, we don't know, because we've pretty much given up on it. Okay, and there's another problem, which goes to my writings about how immigration has to be low and slow. Numbers, demographic critical masses are so important, and I think Enoch Powell, the British politician, emphasized that, and it's just been dropped as an idea. If you have a small enough population that comes over a long period of time, you have a fighting chance to try to impose on them effectively these norms and maybe even get some internalization after a number of generations. That remains to be seen. We've seen it for some people. Let me say that I think part of the reason that the discussion is so muddled is that until recently, we had fairly low levels of immigration from non-Western societies. These people were very self-selected. They were very attracted to Western norms and the Western mindset. Therefore, we got this kind of anecdotal sense that people from third world places really were capable of becoming Westernized because those people were capable of becoming Westernized. I mean, there is a bell curve of individuals from all sorts of backgrounds. This was brought home to me when I went to school at Oxford after I graduated from college. And there was this small coterie at Oxford of British young people who gravitated to the Marshall Scholars and the Rhodes Scholars. They were kind of born American in the way that they looked at life. They just kind of started out that way. And I think those are some of the people that used to come from Iran, used to come from even Africa.
They're highly selected.
Yes, they're self-selected. India.
They are not typical of their home societies.
They are not.
We then imagine, and that's still happening today. People would come from India, for example, come here to go to school. I have some friends that I knew in graduate school. They went off and made money. Very successful, but they're not typical of India.
But there's mass migration now, and there's chain migration, and we are really getting way beyond the people who are self-selected because they're of the Western frame.
So we've come to the end of our hour. I want to call a halt now. But what we've seen, and this is what I hope for the whole series, and the idea of cultural differences, when you get into it, there are endless new ideas appear. And you go off in directions that, frankly, the society is not willing to talk about, and we're going to talk about it. So thanks very much to Amy. Thanks very much for Jason. And we'll go on to the next discussion, and we'll have another quite unpredictable discussion. So thanks very much for you. And we'll, I'm sure, be in touch about this. The main gist is simply discussion, and I thank everyone involved for your contribution. Okay.
Thank you.
Talk again. Same to Jason. And so I'm going to sign off now, and I'll talk to you again soon.